In the center of Paris stands a building that consumed 2 centuries to complete. Notre Dame Cathedral rises 69 meters above the Seine, its Gothic towers visible across the city. Construction began in 1163 under a man who should never have possessed such power. No one has built anything remotely comparable since. The reason has nothing to do with declining faith or changing architectural tastes. The world that made Notre Dame possible was destroyed by plague, the Reformation, and the systematic extinction of the knowledge required to build such structures. What replaced it reveals something troubling about what we have lost. Bishop Maurice de Sully was born to peasant farmers in the village of Sully-sur-Loire around 1120. His parents were poor. His prospects were limited. Medieval society offered few paths for advancement to those born without wealth or title. The church was one. Maurice was intellectually gifted. He studied at the Cathedral school in Paris, where his abilities attracted attention. He rose through church ranks through talent rather than family connection, an unusual trajectory in an era when most bishops came from noble families with estates and political influence. By 1160, Maurice had become Bishop of Paris. He controlled the wealthiest and most politically significant diocese in France. He was different from his peers. Most bishops focused on administration and politics. Maurice was obsessed with building. In 1160, Paris was becoming the intellectual and political center of France. King Louis VII was consolidating royal power. The University of Paris was attracting scholars from across Europe. The city's population was growing, but its cathedral was inadequate. The old Romanesque structure that had served Paris for centuries was small, dark, and architecturally outdated. Maurice saw an opportunity. He could build something that would define Paris for centuries. He could create a monument that would establish the church's permanence and power at the moment when royal authority was expanding. He could build the greatest cathedral ever attempted. Maurice obtained backing from King Louis VII in 1163. The king recognized the political value of supporting such a project. Pope Alexander III visited Paris that spring and agreed to lay the foundation stone during Easter celebrations. The timing was strategic. Easter represented resurrection and renewal. Beginning construction during the holiest week of the Christian calendar signaled divine approval. On the Ile de la Cité in the center of Paris, visible from both banks of the Seine, Maurice staked out the cathedral's boundaries. The design was audacious. The main structure would measure 128 meters in length and 48 meters wide at the transept. The nave would soar 35 meters high. 2 bell towers would rise 69 meters. The building would accommodate 9,000 people when packed for major ceremonies. Nothing in France approached this scale. Maurice was attempting something unprecedented. He hired the best master masons available. These men possessed knowledge of geometry, engineering, and structural mechanics transmitted orally through guild traditions. They had served 7-year apprenticeships. They understood how stone behaved under load, how arches distributed weight, how foundations must be designed for stability. Their knowledge was empirical rather than mathematical, accumulated through generations of trial and error. Maurice gave them an impossible task to build a structure taller and more luminous than anything previously achieved and make it last forever. Construction began immediately. Workers excavated foundations into the bedrock of the Ile de la Cité. Limestone was quarried near Paris and transported by boat along the Seine. The construction workforce exceeded 1,000 people. Master masons commanded the project. Journeyman masons performed skilled cutting and placement of stone. Laborers transported materials and mixed mortar. Carpenters built scaffolding and prepared timber for the roof. Glaziers created stained glass windows. Metalworkers forged iron reinforcement. The entire enterprise operated as a permanent construction site that would outlive everyone working on it. Maurice visited the site regularly during construction, making decisions on details that ranged from stone selection to window design. He worked directly with the master masons, refining plans as the structure rose. The project consumed his attention completely. He had responsibilities as bishop, administering the diocese and managing church property, but building Notre Dame became his life's work. He understood that he would not live to see completion. The scale guaranteed that, but he could establish the vision and ensure the work continued after his death. The materials came from across the region. The timber roof required approximately 5,000 oak trees, each 300 to 400 years old, at harvest. Every beam was hewn from a single tree using axes and adzes. The forest that built Notre Dame's roof had been growing since before Charlemagne. Lead for the roof weighed more than 210 tons, cast into over 1,000 plates and installed by hand. The scale of material consumption was staggering. Salisbury Cathedral in England, built during the same period, required 70,000 tons of stone, 3,000 tons of timber, and 450 tons of lead. Notre Dame was larger. The financial model that sustained this construction seems alien to modern economics. The project cost $1 billion in current value. That money came from multiple sources over the 2 centuries of construction. Maurice contributed from episcopal funds. The Bishop of Paris controlled vast property holdings that generated rental income. King Louis VII contributed royal funds as a display of piety and power. Wealthy individuals purchased burial rights within the cathedral, donating portions of their estates for the privilege of being interred beneath the floor. Indulgences provided another revenue stream. Pope Urban IV offered remission of sins to those who donated to cathedral construction. The practice would later fund St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, raising over 100,000 florins through indulgence sales. Pilgrimages would bring offerings once the cathedral possessed important relics. Guilds and merchant organizations made corporate donations. The money flowed in steadily, but never fast enough. The first Mass in Notre Dame was celebrated in 1182, 19 years after construction began. The building was far from complete, but enough structure existed to hold services. Maurice presided over the ceremony. The king attended. Nobles from across France witnessed the event. Worshippers stood in a space unlike anything that had existed in Paris before. The nave soared upward. Colored light fell through windows that were still being installed. The scale dwarfed the congregation. This was what Maurice had envisioned, a space that made humans feel small and directed their attention toward heaven. In 1239, King Louis IX transferred the crown of thorns to Notre Dame in a procession that became legendary. Louis had purchased the relic from the Emperor of Constantinople for 135,000 livres, more than half the annual royal revenue. The procession through Paris to Notre Dame involved the entire court. Louis carried the crown himself, walking barefoot to demonstrate humility. The event established Notre Dame as the spiritual center of France. Maurice de Sully died in 1196, 33 years after laying the foundation stone. He was approximately 76 years old. The cathedral was perhaps 1/3 complete. The main structure was rising, but decades of work remained. The western facade had not been started. The bell towers existed only in plans. The elaborate sculptural program was barely begun. Maurice had devoted the last 33 years of his life to a building he would never see finished. He left detailed instructions for continuation. He had trained a generation of craftsmen. He had established the funding mechanisms, but the cathedral was his vision, and he died without seeing it realized. The work continued. Other bishops followed Maurice. Other master masons took command. The construction site operated continuously through the 13th century. Workers lived and died without seeing completion. The structure was not finished until 1345, a span of 182 years from foundation to completion. Walking into Notre Dame before the 2019 fire revealed what that money and those 182 years created. You entered through the portal of the Last Judgment on the western facade. The doorway was carved with scenes of souls being weighed and sorted, paradise on one side and damnation on the other. The stone figures were so detailed that you could see expressions on medieval faces, terror and joy carved by craftsmen who had been dust for 700 years. Inside, the nave stretched forward 130 meters. The stone columns rose 35 meters to ribbed vaults that seemed to float without support. The effect was intentional. Gothic builders wanted to create the illusion that stone could defy gravity, that the building was ascending toward heaven through pure faith rather than engineering. First-time visitors stopped walking and looked up, disoriented by the scale. The rose windows dominated the transepts. The north rose window measured 12.9 meters in diameter and contained most of its original 13th century glass. Medieval glaziers had created colors that modern chemistry cannot duplicate. The blue in particular, called Chartres blue after the cathedral that perfected it, resulted from a glass-making process that was never written down and was lost when the craftsman died. Standing beneath the north rose on a sunny morning, with colored light falling across the stone floor in geometric patterns, visitors experienced what medieval worshippers had experienced. Before the fire, 12 to 13 million tourists visited Notre Dame annually, more than any other monument in Paris. They came to see what $1 billion and 182 years of labor had created. The construction techniques were sophisticated beyond what most people imagine when they think of medieval building. Notre Dame was the earliest Gothic cathedral to use iron reinforcement extensively. This was only discovered after the 2019 fire exposed the structure beneath the stone. Iron staples bound blocks together throughout the building, a technique that builders kept secret and that was lost after the Gothic era ended. The use of iron allowed thinner walls and taller structures than stone alone could support. The engineering was empirical rather than mathematical, but it was engineering nonetheless. Builders understood load distribution, structural redundancy, and material properties through accumulated experience rather than formal theory. Notre Dame represented the peak of a building boom that transformed Europe. The Gothic style had emerged in northern France just decades earlier. The Abbey of Saint-Denis, completed in 1144, had demonstrated new techniques. Pointed arches distributed weight more efficiently than rounded Roman arches. Flying buttresses allowed walls to rise higher and thinner. Ribbed vaulting created soaring interior spaces. Massive windows filled these spaces with colored light. The combination was revolutionary. Within 50 years, construction had begun on 87 major Gothic cathedrals across France alone. The resources devoted to cathedral building exceeded anything else medieval society attempted. A groundbreaking 2012 academic study examined the economics of Gothic construction in the Paris Basin between 1100 and 1250. During this 150-year period, 21.5% of the regional economy was devoted to church construction. Over 1,400 Gothic churches rose in this single region during this time. Imagine if modern society devoted 1/5 of its entire economy exclusively to constructing religious buildings. That was the scale of commitment that medieval civilization made. The timeline of Gothic cathedral construction reveals the system at its peak. Chartres Cathedral, one of the finest Gothic structures ever built, was reconstructed in just 26 years after a devastating fire in 1194. The building that stands today was completed by 1220, a speed never matched for a cathedral of comparable size and sophistication. The rapid construction resulted from concentrated royal and papal support, exceptional organization, and the alignment of resources at a moment when the Gothic style had matured, but the system that built cathedrals had not yet begun to fail. Amiens Cathedral took 49 years. Reims Cathedral took approximately 90 years. York Minster in England required 252 years. Cologne Cathedral in Germany took 632 years from foundation to completion, though construction stopped entirely for nearly 400 years during that span. A medieval crane stood atop Cologne's unfinished South Tower for 4 centuries, becoming a symbol of interrupted ambition. The reason the system failed can be stated in 2 words: Black Death. The plague arrived in Europe in 1347. Within 5 years, between 30 and 60% of Europe's population died. The mortality varied by region, but no area was spared. The economic consequences were immediate and catastrophic for cathedral construction. Labor became scarce. The survivors could demand dramatically higher wages. English lords saw their income contract by 20% between 1347 and 1353, while skilled craftsmen became expensive and difficult to find. Construction at Norwich Cathedral stopped abruptly on June 25, 1349. Work did not resume until 1355. The ambitious expansion of Siena Cathedral was permanently abandoned. The new structure would have been the largest in Italy. Construction stopped in 1348 when the Black Death arrived. The unfinished nave walls still stand today, incorporated into other buildings. The expansion was never resumed. Beauvais Cathedral began construction in 1225 with ambitions to exceed every existing structure. The choir reached 46.3 meters, the tallest ever attempted. The vaults collapsed in 1284. The rebuilt choir stood, but the transept was never completed. A crossing tower added in 1569 immediately collapsed. Today, Beauvais consists of a choir and transept with no nave. The building stands frozen at the moment collapse made completion impossible. Westminster Abbey's twin western towers remained unbuilt for 500 years until completion in the 1740s. Ulm Minster began in 1377, stopped in 1543, and was not finished until 1890. The demographic collapse destroyed the financial model of cathedral construction. A project requiring 21.5% of regional GDP could only be sustained when population, productivity, and economic growth aligned. The Black Death broke that alignment permanently. The labor shortage made construction prohibitively expensive. French historian Georges Duby captured the transformation. As the power of the church and nobility waned, so did the willingness to contribute both time and money. The Reformation delivered the second blow. Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in 1517, attacking indulgences as corrupt practices that exploited believers. Indulgence sales had been a primary funding mechanism for cathedral construction. The Protestant Reformation eliminated this funding source across Northern Europe. Protestant reformers destroyed altars, smashed statues, and broke stained glass windows in cathedrals across Germany, England, and the Netherlands. Building new Gothic cathedrals became not just economically impossible, but theologically objectionable. In England, Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries between 1537 and 1542 stripped cathedrals of accumulated wealth. Durham Cathedral was stripped of its wealth between 1537 and 1538. The economic engine that had sustained cathedral construction for 4 centuries was systematically dismantled. The resources existed. The population eventually recovered. But the willingness to devote 21.5% of regional GDP to building Gothic churches never returned. The Renaissance shifted cultural values. Classical architecture from Greece and Rome became the prestige style. Gothic was dismissed as barbaric. Florence Cathedral's dome, completed by Brunelleschi between 1420 and 1436, marked the decisive shift. It was celebrated as a triumph of human reason over medieval superstition. Professor Stephen Murray of Columbia University described the cultural transformation. The church lost its position as the sole arbiter of knowledge and truth, and the Gothic cathedral lost its role as a symbol of this knowledge and truth. The cathedral had represented more than religious faith. It embodied the medieval understanding of the universe, with its soaring vertical space directing attention toward heaven, its structural logic reflecting divine order, and its decoration teaching scripture to an illiterate population. The Renaissance offered a different worldview, one centered on human achievement and classical learning. The cathedral became obsolete as a symbol even before it became obsolete as architecture. The guild system that transmitted cathedral building knowledge began declining during the Reformation and ended with the French Revolution. In 1791, France abolished guilds entirely. The 7-year apprenticeships that trained stonemasons disappeared. The techniques for cutting stone, carving decoration, mixing mortar, and engineering vaults were lost within a generation. Modern apprenticeships last only 3 years. Joe Alonzo, master stonemason at Washington National Cathedral, spoke about this loss. Andy, Sean, and I are not able to pass on our skills to the next generation, breaking a tradition at the cathedral since construction began in 1907. The classical parts of the trade are harder to come by. We are now in our 50s. What do we have left? 15 years or so? This generation cannot let this slip, or it may be too late. The knowledge required to build Gothic cathedrals is dying with the last generation of traditionally trained craftsmen. The political barriers multiplied. The rise of nation-states redirected resources from religious monuments to secular power. The French Revolution exemplified this shift. Notre Dame was vandalized during the Revolution. The cathedral was converted to a temple of reason. The building served as a warehouse. The gallery of king statues on the facade were beheaded because revolutionaries thought they represented French monarchs. They actually depicted biblical kings, but accuracy mattered less than symbolism. For decades after the Revolution, Notre Dame deteriorated. The roof leaked, stone crumbled, statues fell. By the 1840s, serious discussion centered on whether to demolish the cathedral entirely. The building occupied valuable land in central Paris. The structure was damaged beyond easy repair. Many argued for demolition and replacement with something modern. One man saved Notre Dame. Eugene Viollet-le-Duc was 30 years old in 1844 when he won the commission to restore the cathedral. He was an architect and historian who had studied medieval building techniques. He believed Gothic architecture represented French cultural achievement and that Notre Dame specifically embodied centuries of French history. He convinced the government that restoration was possible and necessary. He secured funding. He spent the next 23 years rebuilding Notre Dame. Viollet-le-Duc's restoration was controversial. He did not simply repair damage, he reimagined the cathedral as it might have been if construction had continued through the 14th and 15th centuries. He added elements that never existed in the original design. The famous spire that burned in 2019 was Viollet-le-Duc's creation, added in the 1860s. The gargoyles that tourist photograph are mostly 19th century additions. He was not restoring Notre Dame to historical accuracy. He was completing Maurice's unfinished vision according to his own interpretation. The decision was strategic, not scholarly. Viollet-le-Duc understood that Notre Dame needed to be spectacular to justify its preservation. A merely accurate restoration of the damaged 13th century structure would not inspire public support. An enhanced cathedral with a dramatic spire and elaborate decoration would become a tourist attraction and symbol of French culture. He was right. The restored Notre Dame became one of the most famous buildings in the world. Victor Hugo's novel, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, romanticized the building. The cathedral that Maurice built and Viollet-le-Duc saved became central to French national identity. Viollet-le-Duc died in 1879, his restoration complete. Notre Dame had been transformed from a crumbling medieval relic into a celebrated monument. The cathedral endured by becoming something its builder never intended, exactly like Biltmore would a generation later. Modern construction faces barriers medieval builders never encountered. Building codes regulate foundation depth and window size. Environmental regulations govern stone quarrying. Labor laws mandate working conditions. The permitting process alone would take years and cost millions. At least 1,600 of France's 40,000 religious buildings are closed due to disrepair. Estimates suggest 2,500 to 5,000 French churches may be demolished by 2030. The nation that built 87 major Gothic cathedrals cannot maintain the buildings it already has. Each cathedral requires millions in annual maintenance. The money must compete with schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. The comparison to modern construction reveals what changed. SoFi Stadium in Los Angeles cost $6.75 billion. Allegiant Stadium in Las Vegas cost $2.33 billion. Cowboys Stadium in Dallas cost $1.2 billion. These are the cathedrals of modern America, monuments to professional sports rather than religious faith. The St. Louis Federal Reserve explicitly drew this parallel. Sports stadiums are often compared to the medieval cathedral in their attempt to dominate the skyline and inspire civic pride. Joseph Campbell observed that if you want to see what a society really believes in, look at what the biggest buildings on the horizon are dedicated to. Medieval Europe built cathedrals, modern America builds stadiums, societies invest resources in what they value. The priorities have shifted entirely. Yet one cathedral is still under construction. The Sagrada Familia in Barcelona has been rising since 1882. Antoni Gaudí began work on a design that combined Gothic structural principles with Art Nouveau decoration and organic forms inspired by nature. Gaudí died in 1926 with the project barely begun. The Spanish Civil War destroyed many of his plans and models. Construction continued through the 20th century, slowly and with many interruptions. The expected completion date is now 2026, marking 144 years of construction. The cumulative cost approaches 480 million euros, roughly $520 million. This is less than one major American football stadium. The annual construction budget exceeds 60 million euros, funded entirely by donations and entrance fees from the 4.8 million tourists who visited in 2024. The Sagrada Familia survives as a tourist attraction that generates its own revenue. It is not funded by a community devoting 21.5% of regional GDP to construction. The Notre Dame fire in 2019 revealed what restoration costs when disaster strikes. On April 15th, fire broke out at 6:18 p.m. The 750-ton spire collapsed at 7:53 p.m. after burning for approximately 90 minutes. The fire burned for 15 hours in total. 2/3 of the medieval timber roof was destroyed. 3 holes opened in the stone vaulted ceiling. The damage was catastrophic, but could have been worse. All 3 rose windows survived. The main structure remained standing. Sacred relics were rescued. The bells were saved. The restoration cost approximately 846 million euros, roughly $928 million. The work employed between 1,000 and 2,000 workers from 250 companies. Approximately 1,000 to 2,500 oak trees were harvested from 175 French forests to rebuild the roof. Each tree was valued at approximately 15,000 euros. Traditional hand-hewn beams were cut with medieval pattern axes. Many workers belonged to Les Compagnons du Devoir, a revival of medieval guild traditions that trains craftsmen in traditional techniques. The restoration took 5 years. Notre Dame reopened on December 7, 2024, with approximately 40 heads of state attending the ceremony. The speed was remarkable, faster than the original construction of comparable sections. Louise Bossière, a restoration craftsman, explained what made it possible. Making it in 5 years was hard. They had to do it. There was no choice. They took photos and looked at archives and made it exactly the same. The techniques, the visuals, the aesthetics, everything was exactly the same. It was easier today because of technology. American carpenter Hank Silver, who worked on the restoration, reflected on the original builders. Traditional carpenters had a lot of that in their heads. It is pretty amazing to think about how they did this with what they had, the tools and technology they had at the time. The restoration demonstrated that skilled craftsmen still exist. The techniques can be relearned. The work can be done. But only in response to disaster, not for new construction. Society will spend nearly $1 billion to repair something built 800 years ago. It will not spend that money to build something new in the same style. Who owns Notre Dame today? The question reveals a transformation at the heart of the cathedral story. The cathedral belongs legally to the French state under the 1905 law separating church and state. The Catholic Church uses it for services but does not own it. The French government maintains it, and it resents the cost. Tourists generate no direct revenue. Admission is free. The building sits in legal and financial limbo that would astonish Maurice de Sully. The restoration after the 2019 fire created immediate conflict. President Emmanuel Macron promised completion in 5 years, an aggressive timeline that required extraordinary effort and funding. He announced an international design competition for a modern replacement spire. Architects proposed glass, titanium, and contemporary designs that would mark the 21st century contribution. Public fury forced abandonment of the plan. The French demanded exact replication of Viollet-le-Duc's 19th century spire. Macron retreated. Restoration. The funding model exposed deeper problems. 846 million euros came from private donations, not government budgets. Wealthy donors contributed millions, often specifying exactly how their money could be used. Bernard Arnault, France's richest man, pledged 200 million euros. The Betancourt family pledged 200 million euros. François Pinault pledged 100 million euros. American donors contributed over $57 million. The donors gained influence over restoration decisions. The government controlled the cathedral legally, but depended on private wealth to maintain it. Donations. The Catholic Church found itself sidelined from decisions about its own cathedral. The Archbishop of Paris could suggest liturgical requirements, but could not control construction choices. The French Ministry of Culture made final decisions based on historical preservation standards and donor preferences. Church. The descendants of the original builders have no connection to the cathedral. Maurice de Sully left no family that claims inheritance. The master masons who built Notre Dame trained apprentices who trained successors through generations, until the guild system collapsed. That transmission ended. The craftsmen who restored Notre Dame after the 2019 fire learned their skills from modern training programs that attempt to recreate medieval techniques. They are not the spiritual descendants of the original builders. They are technicians replicating work they admire but do not fully understand. Continuity. The Vanderbilt descendants still live at Biltmore, maintaining connection to George's vision even as the house operates as a business. Notre Dame has no equivalent continuity. The building stands, it functions, tourists visit, services occur. But the cathedral has been severed from everyone who built it, everyone who conceived it, and everyone who originally gave it purpose. Severed, the question is whether this represents loss or progress. The argument for progress is straightforward. Gothic cathedrals consumed enormous resources to create buildings that served limited practical purposes. The same stone, timber, and labor that built Notre Dame could have built housing for thousands of people. Medieval society devoted 21.5% of its regional gross domestic product to building churches, while most people lived in poverty and died young. The misallocation of resources was staggering. Modern society distributes construction budgets more rationally. We build hospitals for healing, schools for education, housing for shelter, and transportation infrastructure for commerce. The craftsmanship of Gothic construction was remarkable, but it was also wasteful. Hours of skilled labor went into carving stone decoration that most people could barely see. Progress, the argument for loss is more complex. Gothic cathedrals represented collective achievement on a scale that modern individualistic societies rarely attempt. When medieval communities devoted 21.5% of regional gross domestic product to church construction, they were making a collective decision about priorities: loss. The decision may seem irrational by modern economic standards, but it created buildings that have served their communities for 800 years and will likely stand for centuries more. Modern commercial buildings are designed for 50 to 100-year lifespans. We do not build for permanence. The craftsmanship embodied in Gothic cathedrals represented knowledge accumulated over generations. Master masons understood structural principles that were not written down and could not be taught from books. When cathedral construction ended, that knowledge began to disappear. The empirical understanding of how stone behaves under different loads and stresses, developed through centuries of trial and error, has been largely lost. The cultural loss may be the most significant. Gothic cathedrals were community projects that spanned generations. Workers who laid foundation stones knew they would never see completion. They worked anyway, creating something that would serve future generations they would never meet. The psychology of such long-term thinking seems alien to modern culture. We optimize for quarterly returns and immediate gratification. The idea of starting something that will take 2 centuries to finish is almost incomprehensible. At least 90 major Gothic cathedrals survive across Europe. Most have permanent restoration teams because the maintenance never ends. York Minster employs 24 stonemasons full-time. Salisbury Cathedral had scaffolding in place for 37 years during external restoration. The cathedrals survive as museums, tourist attractions, and active churches. But no new cathedrals are being built in the Gothic style. The final question is whether it could begin again. Could modern society build a cathedral like Notre Dame if it chose to do so? The technical answer is yes. The knowledge still exists in diminished form. Training institutions teach traditional stonemasonry. Organizations like the Cathedrals Workshop Fellowship at Canterbury, Durham, and York preserve techniques. Computer-aided design could model Gothic structures. Modern materials could replicate historical appearance. The physical capability exists. The economic answer is more complicated. A new Notre Dame would cost billions of dollars. The construction time would still span decades. The building would serve limited practical purposes. The same resources could build hospitals, schools, or housing. Democratic societies struggle to justify such spending when immediate needs go unmet. The cultural answer is the most difficult. Building a cathedral requires collective commitment across generations. It requires communities to value permanence over flexibility, beauty over efficiency, and the distant future over the immediate present. It requires accepting that most workers will die before completion. It requires faith, not necessarily in religious terms, but faith in the value of creating something that transcends individual lifetimes. Modern individualistic culture struggles with such long-term collective thinking. The knowledge is dying. Joe Alonzo warned that his generation cannot pass on traditional skills. Modern apprenticeships are too short. The guild system is broken. Each year, fewer people possess the understanding required to build cathedrals. The capability is disappearing not through deliberate choice, but through neglect. Standing before Notre Dame today, visitors see a building that took 182 years to construct, survived 800 years of history, burned catastrophically, and was restored in 5 years through extraordinary effort. The restoration demonstrated that modern society retains some capability to maintain Gothic cathedrals, but it also demonstrated the limits. The restoration cost nearly $1 billion and required mobilizing craftsmen from across Europe. The effort was only possible because Notre Dame is irreplaceable, a World Heritage Site whose destruction shocked the global community. No such effort would be mounted for a new construction. We will preserve what our ancestors built. We will not build new cathedrals ourselves. The cathedral stopped rising not because we lost the ability or the wealth, but because we lost the will. We choose to spend billions on stadiums that will last 50 years rather than cathedrals that would last 1,000. We choose efficiency over permanence, utility over beauty, and immediate returns over generational investment. These are not necessarily wrong choices, they are simply different choices that reflect different values. The Gothic cathedrals remain as monuments to a worldview we no longer share. They stand as evidence that past societies made different calculations about what mattered. They survived because they became museums, preserving not just buildings, but the record of what humans once chose to build when they were building for God rather than profit. Whether modern society is richer or poorer for abandoning such projects remains an open question. We have gained much in practical efficiency. We may have lost something harder to quantify in collective ambition and permanence. The cathedrals will outlast us, silent witnesses to capabilities we no longer exercise and values we no longer hold.